Most people believe that the story of Jesus Christ is solely a matter of faith, confined within the sacred pages of the New Testament and understood only through the lens of spiritual conviction. They accept him as the Son of God, based on the compelling, transformative testimony of Scripture and the living tradition of the Church that has endured for 2 millennia. But the Bible says in the book of 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 15 that we must always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks us to give the reason for the hope that we have, which means our belief must stand not just on faith, but on verifiable, objective truth that can withstand the fiercest scrutiny of the skeptic. However, the world today, especially the world of academia and historical criticism, often dismisses the entire narrative as myth, claiming there is insufficient external, non-Christian evidence to prove that a man named Yeshua, who claimed to be the Messiah, lived, died, and was worshipped in first-century Palestine. What are they hiding from us when they assert that Jesus is merely a construct of religious fervor, a fictional hero designed to comfort the masses? Why do so many historians overlook the overwhelming body of independent evidence compiled by hostile and neutral witnesses alike that anchors the historical Jesus firmly in the bedrock of ancient history? Today, you will discover the truth, transcending the boundaries of Sunday school and theological debate. Get ready to embark on a forensic investigation across the dusty scrolls of the Roman Empire, where we will unearth 13 historical proofs so compelling, so objective, that they shatter the myth of myth, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that Jesus Christ walked the earth exactly as the ancient texts describe. The stakes could not be higher. If Jesus Christ is merely a legend, then the entire structure of Western civilization, built upon his teachings, crumbles into dust, and the faith of billions is rendered moot. But if we can establish, using sources completely independent of the Gospels, sources written by cynical Roman governors, cautious Jewish historians, and mocking pagan philosophers, that Jesus existed, was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and had followers who worshipped him as God, then the foundation of Christianity is historically unshakable. We are not asking these ancient scribes to confirm his divinity. We are simply asking them to confirm his existence and the core facts of his brief, transformative life. We must transport ourselves back to the 1st century, to the sprawling, efficient, and utterly brutal machine that was the Roman Empire. Rome demanded order, demanded taxes, and demanded submission. Anything that disrupted this carefully orchestrated peace, anything that hinted at insurrection or strange new deities, was met with swift and crushing force. It is precisely within this environment of suppression and documentation that we find our first indispensable historical evidence, evidence provided by one of the greatest and arguably the most cynical historian of the Roman period, Cornelius Tacitus. Now, Tacitus was a Roman senator and an elite intellectual writing around the beginning of the 2nd century, approximately 115 years after the alleged events. He was not a friend of Christians. In fact, he viewed them with utter disdain, describing their religion as a detestable superstition. This bias, ironically, makes his testimony even more powerful, for he had zero incentive to confirm the historical existence of the Christian founder. Our first monumental proof comes from his magnum opus, the Annals. Tacitus was chronicling the infamous Great Fire of Rome in the year 64 AD, an event widely believed to have been started by the Emperor Nero himself. Nero, desperate to divert suspicion from his own monstrous act, needed a scapegoat. Tacitus records this entire sordid affair, and it is in this context that he introduces us to the Christians. Proof number 1. Tacitus's confirmation of Christ's execution and name. Tacitus writes, and I quote the chilling Latin as translated, "Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace." Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. Pause and consider the monumental weight of those few sentences. This single, non-Christian Roman source confirms three absolutely crucial historical points. 1. That the name Christian derived directly from a person named Christus. 2. That this Christus suffered the extreme penalty, which is a Roman euphemism for crucifixion, thereby confirming the unique, brutal manner of his death. And 3. That this execution occurred during the reign of Tiberius Caesar, and was carried out by the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. Tacitus was not quoting the Gospels. He was accessing official Roman records, the annals of the empire, which contained documentation of state executions and political disturbances in the provinces. This testimony serves as a rock-solid historical anchor, confirming the very foundation of the Gospel narrative from an utterly detached and even hostile perspective. It is impossible to argue that Jesus was a myth when the most respected historian of the era confirms the facts of his life and death, even if he despises the consequences. Proof number 2. Tacitus's confirmation of the spread of Christianity. Following his description of the crucifixion, Tacitus then provides a second layer of proof, which speaks directly to the consequences of Christ's life. He explains that though the superstition was temporarily checked, it broke out again, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, the central meeting place of all that is terrible and shameful. This is Tacitus, a Roman, writing in Rome, confirming two things. The geographic origin of Christianity was Judea, and the immediate rapid spread of the movement all the way to the heart of the empire was an established historical fact by the mid-1st century. If Jesus was merely a fictional character invented 50 years after his alleged death, how did his followers organize, propagate, and become a serious enough political problem to warrant state persecution within a mere 30 years of the alleged founding? The existence of a movement named after a historical founder who was executed is overwhelming evidence. Tacitus provides the essential Roman bureaucratic confirmation. Moving now from the historian chronicling the past to the administrator dealing with the present crisis, we look to the imperial correspondence, which provides our next powerful proof. This brings us to the year 112 AD and the correspondence between Emperor Trajan and his appointed governor of Bithynia Pontus, Pliny the Younger. This area of Anatolia was far removed from Judea, yet here, less than 80 years after the alleged resurrection, Christianity had become a major administrative problem. Proof number 3. Pliny the Younger's confirmation of Christian worship and ethics. Pliny, a highly meticulous and often exasperated governor, writes to Trajan seeking advice on how to handle the ever-increasing number of Christians. He admits he has never been present at a trial of Christians, so he meticulously details his interrogation methods. He writes that he forces accused Christians to invoke the gods, offer wine and incense to the emperor's image, and curse Christ. He notes that those who truly abandon the faith do this easily, but those who are genuine will refuse to curse Christ, a refusal he deems impossible to extract from a true Christian. Pliny then reveals what he learned about their practices under torture and interrogation. He reports that the Christians were accustomed to meeting on a fixed day before dawn, where they would recite a hymn to Christ as to a god, and bind themselves by a solemn oath, not for any wicked purpose, but never to commit fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust when called upon to deliver it. This letter, an official dispatch between the emperor and a provincial governor, is breathtaking in its implication. It is non-theological, purely administrative, and confirms several facts. 1. That Christians existed in vast numbers far across the empire by the early 2nd century, suggesting deep historical roots. 2. They met regularly on a fixed day, suggesting the tradition of Sunday worship was already established. 3. They recited hymns to Christ, worshipping him as to a god, a direct confirmation of the deity of Jesus from a pagan perspective. 4. The moral foundation of their adherents was incredibly strong, forcing the Roman authorities to acknowledge their ethical rigor, even if they found the worship strange. Pliny's letters prove that the movement was centered entirely on the worship of a historical figure named Christ, and that figure was treated as divine. No one worshipped Plato or Caesar this way decades after their deaths. This level of devotion confirms the explosive nature of the Christian claim, which necessarily requires a historical figure at its center whose life and alleged resurrection catalyzed this worship. We now turn our attention from Roman administrators to Jewish historians, specifically one of the most important historical figures of the 1st century outside of the biblical narrative, Flavius Josephus. Josephus was a Jewish priest, scholar and military commander who survived the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD and went on to become a favored chronicler in Rome. He wrote 2 massive works, The Jewish War and Jewish Antiquities, providing the most detailed account of 1st century Jewish life, politics, and religion we possess. If Jesus existed, Josephus, who was writing about events concurrent with the Gospels, had to mention him. Proof number 4, Josephus's mention of James, the brother of Jesus. This evidence is crucial because virtually all modern scholars, regardless of their theological stance, accept this passage as fully authentic and untainted by later Christian interpolation. In Jewish Antiquities, Book 20, Chapter 9, Josephus is describing the anarchy that followed the death of the Roman procurator Festus in 62 AD. He writes about the high priest Pontius the Younger, who Josephus criticizes for his illegal actions. Josephus states that Pontius convened the Sanhedrin and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others, and when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. This is a casual throwaway reference, which is exactly why it is so powerful. Josephus assumes his Roman and Jewish readership knows exactly who he is talking about when he mentions James, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. This demonstrates that by the 60s AD, the man known as Jesus Christ was famous enough in Jerusalem that merely referencing his brother's name was sufficient identification. Josephus confirms that Jesus had a brother named James, a key figure in the early church, and that Jesus was widely known by the title Christ. This small passage completely demolishes the argument that Jesus was a fictional character. We continue our journey through the Roman historical records, looking for evidence of the movement's impact on the imperial capital itself. Our next piece of evidence comes from another Roman historian, Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus, known simply as Suetonius, who wrote around the same period as Tacitus, approximately 121 AD. Suetonius was writing biographies of the 12 Caesars. Proof number 5, Suetonius's confirmation of disturbances in Rome caused by Chrestus. In his biography of Emperor Claudius, Suetonius mentions an expulsion of Jews from Rome. He writes, "Since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he expelled them from Rome." This event is corroborated in the New Testament book of Acts, chapter 18, verse 2, which mentions that Paul met Aquila and Priscilla, Jews who had recently come from Italy, because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. The historical synergy is undeniable. The name Chrestus is a common Roman misspelling or mishearing of Christus, Jesus Christ. Suetonius clearly believed that Chrestus was either physically present in Rome instigating riots, a common misunderstanding of messianic fervor amongst the Roman elite, or that his teachings were causing massive social upheaval within the Jewish community, leading to the necessity of state intervention. Either way, this confirms that the presence and influence of Christ's message were so potent that they caused serious civil unrest in the heart of the empire, requiring imperial decree to stop it. Suetonius, writing from the administrative perspective, provides a third independent Roman confirmation of the historical impact of Jesus Christ. Let us now reach even further back into the 1st century, to the very generation of the events themselves. This is often the most challenging period for historical documentation, yet we find an incredibly early, though fragmented, reference. Proof number 6. Thales' reference to the darkness at the crucifixion. Thales was a Samaritan historian who wrote a history of the Mediterranean world around the middle of the 1st century, possibly as early as 52 AD, making him perhaps the earliest known secular historian to mention Jesus. Although his work is lost, it was quoted extensively by later Christian writers, notably Julius Africanus, writing around 220 AD. Africanus, in defending the Gospel account, quoted Thales concerning the darkness that covered the land during the crucifixion. Africanus wrote, "On the whole world there pressed a most fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness Thales, in the 3rd book of his histories, calls, as appears to me unreasonably, an eclipse of the sun." The significance here is profound. A secular, non-Christian historian writing within 20 years of the crucifixion was aware of, and felt compelled to comment upon, the miraculous darkness that accompanied Christ's death. He attempts to provide a natural explanation, an eclipse, even though an eclipse of the sun is impossible during a full moon, which is when Passover and the crucifixion occurred. The fact that he was compelled to explain the phenomenon proves that the event itself, the historical darkness and earthquake coinciding with the execution of Jesus, was so widely known and documented that it required a rationalist counter-argument almost immediately. Thales confirms that the death of Jesus was accompanied by events that drew international attention, cementing its historical reality. We shift now to the powerful testimony of a Syrian Stoic philosopher writing at the end of the 1st century or the very beginning of the 2nd. This document is fascinating because it is written as a letter from a man named Mara bar Serapion to his son, urging him to pursue wisdom. This is where the narrative begins to intensify, revealing how the cultural consequences of Jesus were understood even by philosophers. Proof number 7, Mara bar Serapion's parallels with Socrates and the wise king. Mara bar Serapion compares the persecution of 3 wise figures, Socrates, Pythagoras, and the Jewish king. He asks, what advantage did the Athenians gain from putting Socrates to death? Famine and plague came upon them as retribution for their crime. What advantage did the men of Samos gain from burning Pythagoras? In a moment, their land was covered with sand. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished. God justly avenged these 3 wise men. The reference is unmistakable. The Jews executed their wise king, and immediately afterward their nation was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. Mara bar Serapion clearly connects the execution of this wise king, who preached new laws and was followed by disciples who continued his teaching, to the cataclysmic historical event of the destruction of Jerusalem. Crucially, Mara bar Serapion notes the persistence of the wise king's followers. Nor did the wise king die for good. He lived on in the teaching which he gave. Written from a purely philosophical, non-religious viewpoint, This letter confirms the execution of a wise Jewish leader, the subsequent destruction of the Jewish nation as a perceived divine punishment, and the continued living influence of his teachings through his disciples. This is compelling independent confirmation that Christ's execution was an established historical fact, linked to major geopolitical shifts in the region. We now return to Flavius Josephus for the climax of our historical investigation. While his reference to James was undisputed, his primary reference to Jesus in Jewish antiquities, known as the Testimonium Flavianum, is historically contested, but the overwhelming consensus among historians today is that Josephus wrote an original substantive passage about Jesus, which was later subtly edited by Christian scribes. The challenge is sifting the historical fact from the pious embellishment. Proof number 8. The authentic core of the Testimonium Flavianum. The original unedited text likely read something like this. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. He was a doer of startling deeds, and a teacher of such people as received the truth gladly. He gained a following both among many Jews and many of Greek origin. When Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, condemned him to the cross, those who had first come to love him did not cease. And the tribe of Christians, so called after him, has not disappeared to this day. Scholars today agree that the phrases suggesting Jesus was the Christ or that he rose from the dead were later additions. However, the core statement remains. Josephus, the premier Jewish historian writing for Roman patrons, confirms 4 absolute historical facts. 1. Jesus was a historical man who lived at that time. 2. He was known as a teacher who performed startling deeds, a very non-committal way for a Jewish historian to describe miracles. 3. He was crucified by Pontius Pilate at the insistence of the Jewish leadership. And 4. The movement survived and was still known as the Christians by 70 to 90 AD. This comprehensive summary from the most vital non-Christian source of the first century acts as the culmination of the evidence gathered so far. It weaves together the threads established by Tacitus, Pliny, and Suetonius, placing the historical Jesus at the absolute center of Jewish and Roman history. The sheer volume of consistent, independent attestation from sources writing across the Mediterranean, Rome, Bithynia, Syria, and Judea, within 80 years of the alleged events, is historically unprecedented for a figure who was not a king or an emperor. If any other figure from the ancient world, say Hannibal or Spartacus, had this many independent references, their existence would be universally accepted without question. The only reason Jesus is questioned is because of the theological implications of his existence. Now we transition to the cascading consequences of Christ's life, moving into the realm of the polemicists, those who actively sought to ridicule and destroy Christianity. Ironically, by attempting to refute the claims of Christianity, they were forced to confirm the historicity of Jesus and the core events of his life. Proof number 9. Lucian of Samosata's confirmation of Christ's crucifixion and teachings. Lucian was a 2nd century Greek satirist, a profoundly cynical and mocking writer who enjoyed lampooning religious zealots, especially the Christians, whom he viewed as foolish simpletons, easily duped. His work, The Death of Peregrine, describes the life of a charlatan who joins and then exploits the Christians. In doing so, Lucian provides a wealth of historical data regarding Christian beliefs. Lucian writes that Christians worship a man who was crucified in Palestine because he introduced this new cult into the world. He notes that the Christians worship this man who is still adored, obey his laws, and believe themselves to be immortal. Lucian's intent was purely derisive, yet his confirmation is vital. He confirms that the founder was a real man, that he was crucified in Palestine, and that his followers structured their entire lives around his teachings, specifically focusing on love for one another and a belief in resurrection. Lucian's mockery is predicated on the fact that this figure, Christ, existed, taught, and was killed. You cannot satirize a historical figure's followers without acknowledging the figure himself. Lucian confirms the historical crucifixion and the radical, life-altering nature of Christ's teachings on his followers. Proof number 10. Celsus's confirmation of Jesus' life, details, and miracles. Celsus was a 2nd-century Greek philosopher who wrote one of the earliest and most vicious comprehensive attacks on Christianity, titled The True Word. Though Celsus's original work is lost, the Church Father Origen quoted vast sections of it verbatim in his response, Contra Celsum. Celsus drew on both Jewish and pagan sources to attack Jesus, and in doing so, he solidified key historical facts. Celsus does not claim Jesus was fictional. Instead, Celsus attempts to explain away the events of the Gospels by attributing them to illicit or deceitful means. Celsus confirms that Jesus was born in a Jewish village, that his mother was Mary, that the family was poor, that he fled to Egypt, and that he performed powerful deeds, which Celsus dismisses as mere sorcery or Egyptian magic learned during his time there. Celsus's argument is not that Jesus did not exist, but that he was a fraudulent magician. This is a critical distinction. Celsus's hostile account confirms the existence of Jesus, his geographical origin, his humble background, his teaching career, and most importantly, the fact that he was recognized for performing inexplicable acts that his followers deemed miracles. Celsus provides a hostile witness to the historical details of Christ's life story, which aligns surprisingly well with the Gospels, providing the historical basis for the theological dispute. We move now beyond the explicit written accounts to the undeniable historical reality that demanded a cause, the existence of the early church itself, an organization so pervasive and rapidly expanding that it is inexplicable without a powerful historical founder and catalytic event. Proof number 11. The rapid, inexplicable rise of Christianity in Jerusalem and beyond. Consider the context of first-century Judaism. The followers of Jesus were Jewish peasants who had attached themselves to a man executed as a criminal and a failed revolutionary. Under Mosaic law, Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 23, states that anyone hung on a tree is cursed by God. For Judaism, a crucified Messiah was an absolute contradiction, a cosmic joke. Yet within weeks of the crucifixion, thousands of Jews in Jerusalem, the very place where he was publicly executed, began following him, culminating in the conversion of approximately 3,000 people on the day of Pentecost, as recorded in Acts. This movement was politically suicidal and theologically absurd from a Jewish perspective. What could possibly compel thousands of cynical, first-century Jews to abandon their traditions and worship a crucified criminal as God? The only compelling historical explanation is that something dramatic and undeniable happened: the alleged resurrection. The very existence of the early Christian movement in Jerusalem centered around the worship of a crucified man who the followers claimed had risen is the ultimate historical proof that Jesus Christ existed, taught, was crucified, and that his followers sincerely believed he conquered death. The existence of the church is the effect. The historical Jesus and the claimed resurrection are the only viable causes. Proof number 12. Archaeological confirmation and material culture. While archaeology cannot prove divinity, it consistently proves the precision and accuracy of the New Testament writers regarding locations, names, and cultural practices, lending undeniable credibility to their overall narrative. We have countless finds confirming the historical existence of key figures and locations intertwined with the story of Jesus. Consider the political figures confirmed by independent inscriptions. We have the famous Pilate stone, discovered in 1961 in Caesarea Maritima, bearing the inscription of Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. This inscription, written by Pilate himself, proves the existence and title of the Roman official who condemned Jesus, placing him historically exactly where the Gospels say he was. We also have ossuaries, or bone boxes, used in Jewish burial practices of the period. One famous ossuary, discovered in 1990, contains the bones of Caiaphas, the high priest who presided over the Sanhedrin trial of Jesus. Another ossuary, dated to the 1st century, bears the inscription Jesus, son of Joseph, while common names, the sheer volume of material evidence confirming the historical stage, from the pool of Siloam to the existence of figures like Quirinius and Herod, makes it historically irresponsible to dismiss the main character of this historically verified setting. The physical history aligns perfectly with the textual history. We have now traveled through 12 undeniable lines of evidence, 2 from Tacitus, the greatest Roman historian, 1 from Pliny the Younger, the imperial governor, 2 from Josephus, the essential Jewish chronicler, 1 from Suetonius, the biographer of the Caesars, 1 from Thallus, the early historian of the Mediterranean, 1 from Mara bar Serapion, the Syrian philosopher, 1 from Lucian, the Roman satirist, 1 from Celsus, the pagan polemicist, 1 from the sociology of the early church. Together, these form an impenetrable fortress of historical fact. But there is a 13th proof, one so overwhelming in its scope and detail that it serves as the ultimate historical confirmation of the entire narrative, going far beyond mere existence and speaking to the integrity of the record itself. Proof number 13, the existence and persistence of the New Testament manuscripts themselves. The New Testament is not merely a theological document. It is a collection of 27 historical texts written by multiple authors across several decades. The sheer volume and proximity of the manuscript evidence for the New Testament dwarf that of any other ancient writing. Consider Homer's Iliad, the second best attested work of antiquity. We have fewer than 650 manuscripts, and the earliest surviving copy dates back approximately 500 years after the original was composed. We rely on those manuscripts absolutely to reconstruct Homer's original text. Now, consider the New Testament. We possess over 5,800 Greek manuscripts, over 10,000 Latin Vulgate manuscripts, and thousands more in other languages, totaling well over 24,000 partial and complete manuscripts. More importantly, the gap between the time the originals were written, in the 1st century AD, and the earliest complete surviving copies is incredibly small. We have fragments like the Rylands Library Papyrus, known as P52, dating to around 125 AD, less than 40 years after the Gospel of John was likely written. We have the Chester Beatty Papyri and the Bodmer Papyri, providing extensive coverage of the New Testament books dating back to the 2nd century, far closer to the originals than anything we possess for classical writers like Caesar, Plato, or Tacitus himself. What does this overwhelming manuscript evidence prove historically? It proves that the story of Jesus, his life, his teachings, his death, and his claimed resurrection were written down and widely copied, distributed, and preserved with meticulous care, starting immediately after the events occurred. The existence of thousands of consistent copies across different languages and geographies proves that the core story we read today is the same story that was being told by the eyewitness generation. This eliminates any possibility of a late invention, a mythical accretion that built up over centuries. The story of Jesus was explosive, immediate, and documented by multiple writers whose records were then preserved by a determined community from the very beginning. This combination of evidence, from hostile Roman record keepers, cynical Greek philosophers, careful Jewish historians, and the unparalleled material documentation of the texts themselves, leaves no room for historical doubt. Skepticism is a healthy historical tool, but outright denial of the existence of Jesus Christ requires ignoring a mass of independent evidence that, if applied to any other historical figure, would instantly validate their life and career. The question is no longer, did Jesus exist? The historical consensus, driven by these 13 proofs, is a resounding yes. The question now becomes, if this man, attested by history, was executed under Pilate, and his followers instantly started a world-changing movement based on their conviction that he was the divine Messiah who rose from the dead, then what do I do with his claim? The historical inquiry is complete, but the spiritual journey has just begun. These proofs serve not to replace faith, but to provide a firm, historical foundation upon which a rational faith can stand unwavering against the storm of modern skepticism. We have confirmed the historical anchor of the Christian narrative. We have confirmed the reality of the man, the brutality of his death, the rapidity of his movement, and the integrity of the documents detailing his life. The history screams his name. Now, as we conclude this profound investigation, I want you to reflect on the immense implications of what we have uncovered. The evidence is not simply scattered fragments. It is a tapestry woven by his enemies, his administrators, and his most determined followers, all confirming the central, pivotal facts. When the world tries to tell you that Jesus Christ is merely a myth, remember Tacitus, forced by Roman bureaucracy to write about the execution on the cross. Remember Pliny, exasperated by Christians singing hymns to Christ as to a god. Remember Josephus, constrained to mention the crucified teacher and his brother James. These are not Christian apologists. They are reluctant, non-Christian historical witnesses to the most significant life ever lived. The truth is not hidden. It is written into the foundational scrolls of the Roman Empire itself. If you found the depth and rigor of this investigation compelling, if these historical anchors strengthen your understanding and your faith, then you must ensure this truth reaches others who doubt. Smash that subscribe button right now to join us in uncovering more biblical and historical truths that the world tries to dismiss. Give this video a thumbs up if you believe these 13 proofs are undeniable evidence, and most importantly, comment below with which of these 13 proofs you found the most shocking or definitive. Your engagement helps defeat the forces of skepticism and shares this vital message across the globe. Do not let this truth fade. Subscribe, like, and comment, and prepare for our next journey deep into the untold histories of Scripture. Thank you for seeking the truth.